Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the roots of a controversial movement that has suddenly roared back into the headlines, the fight for Khalistan.
So if you've been watching the news lately, you've probably seen a lot about a decades-old and often violent movement for a separate Sikh state. The big question on everyone's mind is, after so many years of silence, why is this ghost from the past suddenly back? And why now?
And at the center of it all is this man, Amritpal Singh. Our source material describes him as someone who has, quote, reignited the fire of the 1970s. He's currently on the run from police in Punjab, and his actions have pretty much single-handedly thrust this long-dormant issue right back onto the front page. To really understand what's happening today, we first have to understand him.
So let's start right there. Part 1. A new face, old demands. We're going to look at the man in the middle of this storm, Amritpal Singh, who people are already calling Bhindranwale 2.0. And that's a direct reference to a really controversial, really powerful figure from the movement's violent past.
So who is this guy? Well, Amritpal took over this organization, Waris Punjab Day, back in 2022. But he really exploded into the public consciousness when he and an armed mob literally stormed a police station and successfully demanded the release of one of his associates. That one single brazen act put the Khalistan movement right back in the national spotlight. But to truly understand what he's fighting for, we have to rewind the clock.
Part 2. Seeds of a separate state. You see, the roots of this movement go deep, and they're all tangled up in issues of identity, land, and resources that go back almost 100 years.
In the early 20th century, you see the birth of key Sikh political groups like the Akali Dal. But the real turning points, the ones that really sting, came later. First, there was the absolute trauma of the 1947 partition of India, which just brutally ripped the historic Punjabi homeland in two. And then the reorganization of the state in 1966, which, instead of healing those wounds, just created a whole new set of grievances.
And we're not talking about minor issues here. The brand new capital city, Chandigarh, it had to be shared with the newly created state of Haryana. Some Punjabi-speaking territories, they were just handed over to another state. And maybe most critically for an agricultural powerhouse like Punjab, a new canal system diverted the vast majority of water from its three main rivers to its neighbors. These decisions fueled this deep sense of betrayal that political groups were about to capitalize on, big time.
All right, let's jump to the 1970s. This is when all those political grievances catch fire and escalate into a full-blown violent conflict.
In 1973, the Akali Dal Party passes something called the Anandpur Sahib Resolution, and this document becomes the political backbone of the entire movement. Now, it's super important to understand what this was and what it wasn't. It was not a demand for a totally separate country. It was a call for a highly autonomous Punjab within India, where the central government would only handle things like defense, foreign policy, money, and railways.
And then this man enters the picture, Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. He was a charismatic preacher who completely changed the game. It's interesting. The source material points out that he never actually demanded a separate country himself, but his fiery speeches and his open support for militant groups dragged the whole movement kicking and screaming towards violence.
And this slide just captures that shift perfectly. What began as a peaceful protest movement, the Dharam Yudh Morcha, was started to push for those political demands, but it was quickly hijacked by Bhindranwale. And soon, legitimate political demands were totally overshadowed by violent clashes, assassinations of journalists and police, and attacks on civilians.
So by the early 1980s, you can imagine, the situation in Punjab had just completely spiraled out of control. It was all heading toward a deadly and really tragic climax.
And just look at these numbers, they're staggering. In just a 2-year period, there were over 1,200 violent incidents that rocked the state. Over 450 people were killed. The chaos was escalating, and the Indian government felt it had to do something drastic, especially after Bhindranwale and his heavily armed followers fortified themselves inside the Golden Temple, the holiest shrine in Sikhism.
And here is where it gets even more tragic. Operation Blue Star, the military action that was supposed to end the violence, did the exact opposite. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Bhindranwale was killed, yes, but the storming of the holy site just ignited this devastating cycle of revenge. Just months later, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards. A peace deal was tried the next year, but the Sikh leader who signed it was himself assassinated by militants who refused any kind of compromise.
So after all those years of bloodshed and then years of relative peace, the movement is suddenly making headlines again. So what is it that keeps this idea alive after all this time?
Well, a really big piece of the puzzle is demographics. See, while Sikhs make up only about 2% of India's total population, they are a 61% majority inside the state of Punjab. That concentration is exactly why Punjab has always been, and remains, the political and cultural heart of the movement's demands.
But here's another really critical thing to understand: the movement's international dimension. The source makes it very clear that while popular support for Khalistan inside Punjab is actually quite limited today, the idea is being kept alive and actively promoted by some groups in the Sikh diaspora in countries like Canada, the UK, and the US. This global network is a huge reason for the recent protests you've seen at Indian embassies abroad.
And this brings us full circle, right back to Amritpal Singh. In a video he put out while he was on the run, he said this, and he was making a very deliberate point. He's trying to contrast himself with past leaders who operated from outside the country. He is strategically positioning himself as the guy who's on the ground, in Punjab, ready to directly challenge the state and try to build a whole new generation of followers.
So, as the manhunt for him continues, we're left with a pretty critical question. Are we just witnessing an echo of a painful past, fueled by one charismatic guy? Or could this be the start of an entirely new and frankly unpredictable chapter for this movement?